We start with the annual Pringle lecture, which this year we're so fortunate to have delivered by Maggie Haberman. She is, of course, White House correspondent for the New York Times, based in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which is an achievement in itself. I think we all know what an amazing couple of years she has had. We all read her work from day to day and see her on social media, where I think she has maintained an incredible balance and professionalism in the most unusual of circumstances. She's been doing this for a long time. She's worked at a number of newsrooms before joining the New York Times, and the Daily News and the New York Post among them, and Politico. And her dedication extends to taking a call from her editor while she was on the stage, and she's going to have to duck out just a little before we end to go back to reporting today's cycle. But her work in 2017 has been honored deservedly. She was part of the team that won the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in reporting on Trump's advisors and their connections to Russia, and she also won a Polk Award for similar package of reporting. So please welcome Maggie Haberman.
Thank you so much for having me. It is very humbling to be here. I want to warn you all that I am a much more natural question asker and answerer than I am speech giver, so I hope you will bear with me. But it is a delight to address you as you get ready to join the ranks of one of the least understood and most mistrusted professions in the country. I raised that last point only partly as a joke. You are coming into journalism, or at least leaving a graduate program for it, at a moment when when distrust of what we do is very high, when distortions of our work are becoming more commonplace. And to my mind, what we do has never been more vital, especially in this country. It's never been more complex, more diffuse, and harder to penetrate as a new journalist seeking to engage in work that feels meaningful, as opposed to just living on Twitter, which I do way too much of, and doing something that is substantive. What's going to be important, especially if you want to get into political journalism or covering the White House or Congress or anything in Washington or New York government, is figuring out how to cut through the clutter and the noise in a way that fights for the truth without you looking like you're choosing a side, whether you are or aren't being boxed in that way. To the extent that trust in what we do can be recovered, I think that is going to be how it happens. The role that you could end up playing can be largely by chance, as mine has been, which was an accident of circumstance. So I wanted to talk a lot about the number of odd acts of chance that have happened in my life that led me to where I am, which is, as was noted, covering the White House either from my desk in Midtown Manhattan or from my apartment in Crown Heights or from my car on the BQE. Since January 2017, I do a lot of work in my car. I fell into news reporting by accident. I had studied fiction writing when I was at Sarah Lawrence College, which was a joke for a long time once I went to go work for the New York Post. Not long after graduating, and then at the Daily News. But the closest to news writing that I ever wanted to get into was magazines, women's magazines in particular, and there were a lot more jobs available then. I had all these interviews after I graduated. I could not get a job. I have a father who is a longtime journalist for the New York Times, was fired from the Times, went to the New York Post for 10 years, and then was rehired at the Times. I think he might have been one of the only people ever to be rehired by the Times after being fired. And a mother who has worked in public relations in New York City for 40 years. So I had opportunities that a lot of people wouldn't have. And I heard from a family friend about a copy kit opening at the New York Post, a job where the name doesn't quite describe what you do. It essentially is a clerk, but with the diminishing kid added, to ensure you don't get too cocky. So that's how I started at the New York Post in August of 1996, which basically meant shuttling faxed press releases to the New York Post City Desk inbox, sorting through the mail of the reporters. Jonathan Karl, who's now one of ABC's leading figures, had just left as an education reporter, and I remember having to throw his mail away all the time. And running page proofs of the next day's paper to different editors. But once a week, you got sent out on a general assignment job, or several, depending on what was happening that day. And I was born and raised in this city, but as a reporter in training for a tabloid, I got to experience it in a way that I never had before. I went to parts of the city I'd never seen, talked to people I'd never encountered. One of the experiences I remember most early on was finding my way into a hospital, which technically you're not supposed to get into unless you're a patient there or have family there, to try to track down the family member, the husband of a family where the wife who was pregnant had just been fatally struck by a car, and she and her baby died. And the man was unbelievably upset, understandably so, and I'm still haunted by the experience of him yelling at me to get off the hospital floor. We would often hear from police sources the names of victims of crimes before their family had been notified, and we tried to be very careful not to let next of kin know what had happened before they were formally notified, but the system did not always work, and one time I ended up informing the roommate of a subway pushing victim that her roommate had died, and that was horrible. I talked to the wife of a bus driver who had skidded off the highway on a holiday night during a drive to Atlantic City, leaving several people dead. I think it was a Christmas Eve. And on the advice of a skilled general assignment reporter, I'd scan the eyes of bystanders crowded around a crime scene trying to figure out who had actually witnessed it. This was my early training. I also was working nights as a bartender because I was making $40 a day as a copy kid. And bartending is a very good training for dealing with people. I read somewhere recently a description of being a bartender as the skill of making conversation, and then when the conversation runs thin, you ask questions. You just ask questions to keep the person sitting there, and that is what I did. I had the luck at the time of getting assigned by the Metro editor at the Post to work as an intern for Jack Newfield, the famous muckraking journalist at the Village Voice before he was at the New York Post, whose 10 worst judges list set a tone for a type of accountability journalism that really hadn't existed until then, which was holding judges accountable for their caseload, for their actions, and for their personal lives in terms of how they conducted themselves off the bench. And Jack taught me lessons that shaped my career going forward, but two stand out today in the context of my current job. You can't cover someone or something that you hate. This is vitally important. He was not always successful at that, but he mostly tried. And you can't give in to bullying from the powerful as you pursue a story. And he taught me the second one when we were working together on a 10 worst judges list at the New York Post, and he got a call from a district attorney who he knew very well. I mean, he knew all of the district attorneys very well. But this was someone he had worked with frequently, and there was a judge on our list who the district attorney wanted taken off the list. The DA was concerned about this person getting dinged up in the press. And when Jack balked, the DA said, "You will, quote unquote, lose all access to this office if you proceed." This was new for me, and I was nervous when Jack told me about it, and I asked him what we were going to do, and he said, "You're going to leave the judge in. We can't give in to that kind of intimidation." And so we didn't, and the judge stayed on the list. The DA in question did cut Jack off for a while, my husband reminded me, but the DA eventually came back around, and it was a key lesson for me, which is that sources almost always come back, no matter how much threatening they do. I became a full-time reporter in 1998. I was sent to City Hall the next year. I was really interested in politics, and I had no idea what I was doing, and I had no business being there. But I watched and I learned, and I tried to outwork my competitors and my colleagues. I responded to calls from sources at all hours of the night. I still do that. I met with anyone who was willing to get coffee with me, and I still pretty much do that too. I used to scan the City Record, which was the procurement publication for the city, and look for stories out of that as well. And I discovered the almost fanatical devotion that reporters at the tabloids had to their respective papers in the 1990s between the Daily News and the New York Post. Rudy Giuliani was the mayor, and he held 3 press conferences a day sometimes. He was often confrontational, but never fearful of facing reporters, as we've all gotten a reminder of again in the last few weeks, for those of you who have been following the news. The world changed on September 11th, 2001. I was in Lower Manhattan when the second Twin Tower collapsed. I ran up Church Street with a group of people away from the worst noise I had ever heard. And I spent 3 years covering rebuilding of the World Trade Center site, which meant tracing a tangle of government agencies, all of which wanted a piece of the land and the process, and none of which wanted the responsibility for the disappointment that a group of relatives of those who died were likely to have with whatever redesign plan they chose, and that was exactly what happened. Before that process began, the campaign to replace Giuliani was completely altered by the terrorist attack. Giuliani's endorsement, which had been seen as an albatross essentially before that, his poll numbers were terrible. Poll numbers suddenly went up, his endorsement was valuable. And he described Mike Bloomberg, who had never run for office before and was a businessman, as the best choice against a lifelong politician named Mark Green. Things that had seemed certain to doom any candidate. There was a booklet that one of Mike Bloomberg's corporate employees put together of racially incendiary and misogynistic jokes that he had made while he was running his business. That emerged right before the primary, which was the day of the terrorist attacks. We had all expected that would sink a candidate. That is not what happened, obviously. He became the city's mayor for the next 12 years. And I'll get back to that kind of an event later. But I didn't believe that Mark Green was likely to win by the final weekend before the election, just based on what I was seeing and hearing in conversations with voters around the city who were sounding much more open to Bloomberg. And they were very rattled. It was 6 weeks after the attacks. And I assumed I was probably wrong, since I had not covered any campaigns before that. I'd covered Hillary Clinton's the year before. So I assumed that my sort of gut and feel for this were off. The lesson that I took from that period of time was to trust my instincts and not assume that conventional wisdom was determinative of an outcome. And again, more on that later. I joined Politico in 2010 on the recommendation of an old friend, Ben Smith, who's now at BuzzFeed. And I tried to mine the contacts that I had made over a decade in New York politics, and I really struggled at it. I had tremendous difficulty adjusting my aperture from what made sense in New York to what would be of interest nationally. And especially at Politico, which was very focused on the inside game. And I was setting myself up to cover the 2012 campaign. I kept saying, let's cover Chris Christie, he's gonna be a candidate. He's just across the river in New Jersey. And then there were and I kept just trying to find scoops wherever I was. I had a blog, and I would post 15 items a day because I could engage readers that way. I could get more people to talk to me. One person who was interested in talking to me was in February of 2011, a man named Roger Stone, who you have probably all heard of recently too. And I had dealt with Roger Stone for a decade because he was a consultant on an independent candidate for governor's race in New York in 2002. And he reached out to me about a potential Donald Trump campaign for president. Donald Trump was going to speak at the Conservative Political Action Conference in DC, and it was going to be a big splash because he was thinking of running. And I knew a lot of Trump advisors from New York or people he talked to who had been talking to him about potentially running. One was a pollster named Kellyanne Conway. Another was a pollster named John McLaughlin. I knew from my sources that Stone was in a lot of these meetings, so my editor asked me to do an interview with Stone. And I did, and how would Trump run if he decided to? And the entire interview really was about Trump. It wasn't about Stone. But it put Stone kind of front and center. And the interview, when it was published, had a big picture of Stone, and Stone was in the headline. And Stone said he was not officially working for Trump, that he was informally helping him or wanted him to succeed or something. The next day, I got a statement from Trump's office that just said, Roger Stone is not advising me. Something to the effect of, Roger Stone's not advising me. And as I was done reading the email, I got a phone call from Trump, who said very plainly, Roger Stone doesn't speak for me. I had clearly gotten the point from the statement. I was completely confused. I knew that Roger Stone was in these meetings. I didn't understand why Trump was adamant that he wasn't really there, even though he was, and it was all a little hard to discern, but it was an early window into the disorientation that has become familiar for journalists who are trying to cover the reality that actually exists within the Trump presidency. He did not run that year. During Sweeps Week for The Apprentice, he announced that he would not begin a real campaign. And that was that. And 4 years later, I got a call from an aide to Trump named Sam Nunberg, who you may also have seen on TV recently. And by then I was at The Times, and The Times has always loomed very large in Trump's imagination. I got hired at The Times as basically a general campaign reporter, and I had assumed I would primarily be doing Hillary Clinton stuff because I had covered her for decades. But I got this call from Sam, and he said, Trump is going to declare on June 16th, and we want you to write it. And I said, no. And he said, why? And I said, I'm not going to write a word until he actually runs after 2011. In hindsight, it was not the best call and not the best example of my gut serving me well, but it was defendable. Trump had first started thinking of running in 1987 when he did The Art of the Deal, and he didn't run. He thought of running in 2000, and he didn't run. He thought of running in 2011, and he didn't run. So it was understandable that someone would want to see proof. Trump still wanted to meet with me, according to Sam, so I went to lunch at the Trump Grill in the basement of Trump Tower with Corey Lewandowski to my right and Donald Trump to my left. And Trump was selling me on the case that he was going to run. This was May, I think, of 2015. He was going to run, he was going to declare, and he was clearly getting annoyed that I wasn't buying it. He kept going back and forth between saying something off the record that he would then put on the record. So an example was, off the record, I'm really smart. And he is president, and he did run. He capitalized on endless airtime from cable networks, who outdid one another to get him on air. If one network wouldn't take him for a phone interview, he knew that he could find one that would, which ensured sort of the betting game. And that was how he had played the New York tabloids off each other for decades. He turned himself into a commodity. In New York City over those decades, the view of Trump was as a tabloid sensation and gossip page fixture with a flair for self-promotion, who had been through casino bankruptcies, 2 divorces, the details of which in at least one case that I know of he personally leaked. Outside of the 5 boroughs, I discovered during the campaign, the view of Trump was based on the decade plus on The Apprentice. When I went to visit Iowa to cover Trump rallies, the voters would tell me that he was a self-made man, he was a successful business leader, an innovator. They would describe him in these incredibly lofty terms. And Roger Stone had once warned me that the line between news and entertainment was not as clear for people outside of the news business as it is for us, and it was indeed correct. The trips to Iowa were firsthand evidence of that. No matter how many times we included the full context and picture of Trump's actual background in stories, it rarely penetrated. And to be clear, that is not why we did it. We did it because it was the full truth. But it was a truth that people felt wasn't real because they had seen something different. In November of 2015, Trump's rhetoric about Muslims and terrorism had become a staple of his speeches, and he gave an open-ended answer to a question from a reporter from Yahoo during a wide-ranging interview. And the question was whether he would be willing to put in place a registry of Muslims in the United States. It was not a responsible question because it's not actually something anyone is talking about doing, but his answer was instructive. He did not reject it. He did not say no. He said the government would be looking at, quote unquote, a lot of things. Now, a lot of things is an answer that Trump often gives when he doesn't want to give a specific, but I thought this was an important moment from the Republican candidate who was leading in the polls, and I pushed for a story. But I made an imprecise word choice in the story. I wrote in the lead that Trump had made calls for such a registry as opposed to being open to such a registry. Now, you could argue it's not a meaningful, deep distinction, but Trump and his critics found the opening I'd given them, and they seized on it. The next day, I found myself in the middle of a Twitter storm, the likes of which I have seen many times since, but had never seen then. Breitbart, the website that has moved far from the mission that its original founder had for it, wrote up a piece attacking me as an agent of Hillary Clinton. Trump tweeted a link to that piece. He had about 20 million followers at that point. And he thanked Breitbart, saying it was, quote unquote, so nice when media properly polices media. My Twitter mentions were a cesspool. Trump's campaign aides tweeted the Breitbart story, and later that day at a campaign rally, Trump attacked me, although not by name. And on Twitter, where Washington journalists, including myself, I get no exception for living in New York, spend too much time, a lot of reporters, I was really struck by this at the time, were straining to give Trump the benefit of the doubt that they would never have given almost any other candidate. They kept arguing that he was a first-time politician. Maybe he hadn't realized what he was walking into. He would, of course, clear this up at his next interview. He may not have understood the question. He didn't clear it up. He left it open-ended when he got pushed on it by George Stephanopoulos the next day. And it became clear to people over time that that approach of his was a feature and not a bug. He never apologizes. He never walks things back. He never admits an error, and he is almost always punching at critics when he feels like he's been attacked. I continued monitoring every Trump rally and every interview, and my internal radar would go off anytime he said something new or contradicted himself, which sometimes happened in the same sentence. But when he had moved on to other targets and other controversies, and the news cycle had moved on, his fans still lingered on whatever he had directed the focus toward before. Months later, Trump won the nomination, and then later the presidency. You're all very familiar with that year, and you don't need to rehash this morning. But throughout the year in 2016, I told colleagues at various points that I thought Trump had a true shot of winning. Clinton's numbers with white working class voters in particular, in internal surveys by some Democrats whose numbers I trust, in September 2016 foreshadowed her problems just a few months later. Twitter conventional wisdom insisted Trump was dead after the Access Hollywood tape was revealed by David Fahrenthold in early October 2016. The day after the tape broke, I was really struck by the fact that two Republicans, one of them was Paul Ryan, who withdrew their support for him, or at least sounded notes of something less than supportive about Trump. They were booed by their own voters at their own events those days, and that suggested to me that something funky was going on. And Trump's election felt a bit similar to that night in 2001 when Bloomberg became New York's mayor. It was an event influenced by outside forces and something that conventional wisdom did not consider a real possibility. I stayed on as a White House reporter, and I travel frequently to DC. I will be later today, but I do my job mostly from here. Trump has returned to the attack repeatedly when he doesn't like something I have written. That has continued for most of the last year and a half. More recently, I woke up on a weekend to a string of text messages from friends commenting on a tweet that Trump had made that I hadn't yet seen. This time I was again a Clinton flunky. I think it was Crooked H flunky. And I knew nothing about him, he wrote. It was in response to a story I had written with two other colleagues about his long history of treating his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, very poorly. By now, however, reporters have stopped giving him the instant benefit of the doubt and have become used to the incessant attacks. Trump's fans don't realize how much he, in reality, feeds off and enjoys the mainstream media attention. Media attention was his lifeblood for a very long time in New York. He still tells his friends happily that he, almost with a pride note, they have told me that he's on the front page of the Times now more than he ever was before he was elected, which of course any president is, but it strikes him as very exciting. But not everything that Trump is doing is new or something unseen before in presidential history, including his attempts to influence how the media does its job. And it's really important for reporters not to lose sight of that. Journalists have an enormous amount of power, and I think sometimes we do lose sight of that fact and need to be careful because you are going to be attacked in today's world for doing your job. Much louder than you ever have before. If you write on a difficult or controversial topic, you will be attacked by somebody. I spent 2 decades covering Hillary Clinton, and I was often attacked for things I wrote, and sometimes for things I didn't, such as the Times coverage of her email server. I am not obviously the only one. Mike Schmidt, my colleague and simply one of the greatest journalists of his generation, is the one who did break the news of the Clinton server. And he was criticized heavily at the time and for a while after, but he also broke the stories of James Comey's memos about the pressure the president put on the former FBI director with regard to a probe into the president's former national security advisor, Mike Flynn. Those are 2 stories, 2 ends of the spectrum, same author. The amount of noise that we are all facing is at an all-time high, and the lack of actual basis in fact for that noise doesn't matter very much to members of 2 political tribes who adhere to a norm that their leaders set. Even when evidence contradicts it, they stick with it. So you need to bear in mind that people are going to try to fit you into a box, particularly in the echo chamber of Twitter and on partisan websites, and there are a lot of them. They will also try to make you into the story, something journalists should try to avoid, and it will be your job not to take the bait. One of my all-time favorite journalism movies is Broadcast News, which holds up incredibly well since it's quite old at this point. But there's a great line in it where Albert Brooks, seeing a colleague put himself in a news piece, says, "Yes, let's never forget, we're the real story, not them." The The people you cover, or the people who support the people you cover, are going in this climate to get increasingly deeply personal and use whatever information they have to get a rise out of you. It can get very uncomfortable. The only time I've actually winced is when someone has mentioned my kids on Twitter, which one person started doing at one point, and someone posted something about my children online, but even then I couldn't and didn't let it get in my head. I had an editor at the New York Post named Greg Birnbaum, who once cautioned me not to internalize complaints from either sources or people who you cover, more than making sure you're giving them a fair hearing and checking yourself for being accurate and fair. I remember his line very well: their problems are not our problems. And it's pretty simple, but pretty true. It's Schmidt's job and my job to tune out that noise, and it's going to be your job to do the same. It is all of our jobs to do the most responsible, fearless reporting that we can, which means distinguishing fact from spin and data from that noise. What that does not mean is that it is your job to be the tip of the spear for one group or another. One of the realities of this era that has come into stark relief in the first year of the Trump administration, first year plus, is the limits of the institutions in this country. There is one entity whose mandate is to serve as a check on executive power, and that is Congress. The GOP Congress has generally not sought to play that role with Trump. People are still grappling with what those limitations mean, but one thing should be clear. Journalists are not elected officials. We don't hold hearings, and we aren't going to agree with every critic, no matter what position they're taking. There has been a lot of discussion about the role of the media in the Trump era, and unfortunately, most of it is generated by people who aren't reporters, but who are partisans, and would like to see the outcome in one direction or another. What we have the power to do is examine facts and write the truth, and that has to remain our mission, regardless of the pressures put upon us and regardless of undermining cries about fake news. What people think your job is frequently not the same as what your actual job is. I would urge you all to tweet with as much restraint and precision as possible, with the full knowledge this is not advice I follow, 5 days of the week. But be mindful that you don't have an editor on Twitter. You are creating a digital footprint, and it can be easy to slip and make a mistake that someone will use against you, or that someone will just misunderstand and read your intentions wrong. It's a useful tool for promoting stories and sometimes for reporting, but I'd urge you to recognize the disconnect between what people on Twitter are talking about and what people living their lives in the country and around the world are experiencing. I stress this because Twitter didn't exist when I was coming up and reporting, and I'm confident I would have been fired very early on if I had used it the way it gets used now. I know that it can feel like the rules of journalism, the constraints that we follow in order to be professional and fair, can be weaponized against us. It feels like they are being weaponized against us a lot of the time recently. That doesn't mean we get to change the rules and how we do our jobs. As this White House tries to make us into the opposition party, it is important not to allow that mindset to take hold for you, because we're not. We're also not the property of the president's opponents or critics. We're in a moment where partisan debates are no longer about opinions, but facts themselves, and we are increasingly facing instances of distorted or fabricated fact sets, documents that are made up out of whole cloth, blended in with authentic ones. It is vital in your jobs to take the time to determine what is real and what's not, even if you lose a scoop or a story. One of the things that has been remarkable about this White House and its supporters is the number of people who will not tell us the truth. And figuring out what is real is vital, but it takes time. Everyone will remember who got a story wrong. Fewer will remember who got it right. The loss of an agreed upon fact set is also leading way to a loss of agreed upon human experiences, which is damaging to journalism in a different way, because it serves to make people more afraid of admitting making a mistake. We can't be afraid to admit making a mistake. The difference between the media and politicians is that we provide corrections. We update the record, and we try to fix it as cleanly and quickly as possible. But you are human, and you will make mistakes, and I've made a lot of them. Hopefully you will learn from them. People you cover are also human. What might seem major to you is often a fraction of their lives. What seems minor to you could be hugely important to the person you're reporting on. But no matter what they do and no matter how difficult they might be to cover, they are people, and you can't know what their experience is because it isn't your own. Your job is to try to understand it to the extent you can, without fear or favor, but also without hatred, disdain, or disgust. Your job is not to opine, your job is to report. With that, congratulations, and thank you so much for having me.